Some of the sequels were okay. I remember liking Damien, the Omen Part 2 well enough. And then they did the third one of Sam Neill, which wasn't like very good at all, from what I remember. It's like, oh, Sam Neill's Damien, and then it's not that good.
Take him.
All right, chat. So let's go ahead and get to my review for the first Omen, possibly the last Omen as well. So if you would have asked me that a prequel, sequel, and the sixth film in the Omen horror franchise would not only be the best film in that franchise since the original, which came out in 1976, but also be the better religious horror movie when compared to Sydney Sweeney's Immaculate, and on top of that, be a better movie than the film festival darling Monkey Man, directed by Dev Patel, I would have said that is highly unlikely and maybe even crazy. Well, we're living in crazy times. The sun has vanished, and the first Omen is a really good movie. It's all those things. But before we dive into the film itself, let me provide you with a bit of a synopsis. A young woman named Margaret, on the path to become a nun, starts to question her own faith when she uncovers a terrifying conspiracy to bring about the birth of evil incarnate upon Rome and later the world. So I'll admit right here at the top, I did not have any faith in this movie when I first learned about it. I thought the trailers were fine at best, but the Omen franchise is primarily known for its first film, which is, of course, directed by Richard Donner and released back in 1976. It was one of the seminal horror and genre films of that decade and inspired so much material about the Antichrist. Some of the sequels were okay. I remember liking Damien, the Omen Part 2 well enough. And then they did the third one of Sam Neill, which wasn't like very good at all, from what I remember. It's like, oh, Sam Neill's Damien, and then it's not that good.
Take him.
But most failed to live up to the original, especially the various, just reboots and remakes. I also watched the Lee Schreiber film that came out in the 2000s. So, a horror prequel to The Omen, it just didn't sound all that appealing to me. And even 20th Century Studios seem to have little confidence in the film, investing little in its marketing campaign, and having a review on embargo the day the movie released. It just, all signs just pointed to this movie not being good. But the movie is actually good, really good, in fact, and is anchored by confident direction from Arkash Stevenson, a strong lead performance by Nell Tiger Free, and a really strong and solid supporting cast of character actors, some weird and freaky looking religious imagery that also manages to feel fresh. And all of this is set against the political and social upheaval going on in Rome in the 1970s. So you have this really interesting historical context on top of everything. All of it works together to create an interesting mystery that is bolstered by good performances. And it does something even more impressive and honestly unexpected. And that's the fact that it adds to the lore of the original film in a positive way, not in a negative way. Unlike, say Ridley Scott's Prometheus or Alien Covenant, that make the lore of Alien dumber as it went along. and as more was added to it, Stevenson provides more context for the Antichrist's return, the interesting motivation behind it that I actually found very surprising and original, but also giving us characters that we like and are not just served up to be sacrificed for the sake of things, for the sake of it. You know, I'm mostly unfamiliar with Tiger Free, who plays the film's lead of Margaret. You know, she previously played Marcella Baratheon in Game of Thrones, and I guess in some of the latter seasons, or a season, when she was in Dorne, if I recall. But I don't believe I've seen her in anything else. She's also the main lead in Servant, which I think is this M. Night Shyamalan show, but I haven't seen that show. You know, she's very good here, and I like that she plays her character a little odd. You know, even kooky, one could describe her as, you know, which makes her somewhat unreliable in terms of what she's seeing. You know, it's because of her like rough upbringing, her crisis of faith, the political upheaval, or it could also just be the devil fucking with her. We don't know, but that's what makes her journey interesting to follow throughout this movie as she's exposed to all this stuff. You know, the rest of the cast is, I think, also very good. And they get a lot to do, from Bill Nye, who plays a cardinal with many nefarious secrets, to Ralph Ineson as a priest named Father Brennan, who becomes a friendly ally to Margaret through the course of the movie and their investigation as to what's going on, how it's all related to, you know, the Antichrist, you know, the birth of the Antichrist, something that's these evil people have been trying to do for quite some time. And it's not what you think, which is interesting. Now there are a handful of jump scares in the movie, but not many, and only, I would say, in like the first third or so of the film. The rest of the time, the movie is just building dread and confusion with its atmosphere and use of like creepy Catholic imagery, and it's all complemented with a very good eerie score too. Also, just so much of the movie, this is what really impressed me, so much of the movie is using practical effects. The majority of it, I would say, is practical. And the effects are incredibly well done and do things that involve like a lot of disturbing body horror. It honestly makes some of the stuff in Immaculate look kind of cute in comparison. Lastly, even though it's a prequel, it's not a movie relying on nostalgia to tell its story. Instead, it often feels like a 70s era supernatural horror film. The way in which it's shot, how the effects are used, and how the story unfolds, and how the characters and the actors like speak together, and in pace, it feels like one of those movies from that time period. It's reverent and respectful of those movies, obviously being reverent and respectful the most towards the Omen itself. But it doesn't feel the need to grovel at its feet by throwing reference after reference out there. It honors that film and those films of that era by adopting their aesthetics and their competence in their storytelling. That's why the first Omen is a horror prequel that stands above so many others. Because when you think of a lot of horror prequels, there's not a lot that really stand out. Most of the times, they're really bad. Most of the time, once you finally get to doing horror prequels in your franchise, the franchise is dead. The original actors can't come back. Whoever was playing the original villain is either too old or doesn't want to do it, so they try to reinvent it. They're just like, you don't know the real story or the story behind the story. And it almost always sucks. Always sucks. There are obviously exceptions, of course, but few and far between. And the first Omen just happens to be one of those exceptions, one of those few exceptions, in my opinion, in a long, long time. And it's somewhat sad that, you know, the movie's getting so much praise for everything it's doing. And from the director themselves and to the actors, obviously, who I think do a really good job, and just the effects and the practicalness of them. But and I guess they just didn't know what they had. 20th Century Studios didn't know what they had because they didn't market the movie, and they just didn't have like reviews. They had a review embargo on it, which usually you think like, oh, a review embargo, that means that's there you go. Sure as shit, it's dead. And yeah, they actually had a really good movie, and maybe they didn't know. It's sad because I think because they didn't market it well, because there was just this stink around the film and horror prequels in general, it caused it to underperform because they had a budget of $30 million. They used the $30 million very well in this movie. But I guess it's going to be a bit of a flop, which is kind of sad because it's really good. Of the last several films that I've seen, you know, Immaculate and Monkey Man, this is easily the best. It's better than those movies. And I think it's going to be the Saw X of this year, although Saw X, Saw 10 was, along with being critically successful, was commercially successful. Maybe not as high as the highest grossing film in the franchise, but, you know, it was such a surprise, you know, which that in itself, like you could argue is a prequel sequel to Saw, since most of them are prequel sequels. But I was kind of taken aback just how good this movie is. And I think, yeah, for a lot of people, it's going to be the Saw X of this particular year, and was surprisingly good because you just had a filmmaker in there that had a great vision for it, knew what to add, but embraced the sense, not the references, not that kind of thing in regards to the original movie, but just the aesthetics of it. And that's what makes it such a great film to watch, with a lot of talent on display. So, yeah, I really, really enjoyed this movie. It's one of my favorites so far this year, which I never thought I would say, but it's true. It's true. But what about you guys? Were any of you aware of this prequel sequel to The Omen, the first Omen? For those of you who have seen it, did you like it as much as I did? Were you more mixed on it, or did you downright hate it? Let me know.